All right, welcome world. I'm starting to see various connections happening in terms of our various platforms. Waiting for everyone to get online, starting to connect. Still waiting for one last platform, but welcome to those who are already tuned in. And we should be able to start the program shortly. There we go. We're all on board. Okay, so thank you for joining me for another episode of the Currents Deep Dives. I thought today we would look at the title track from the album, Currents, which is the longest song on the album and probably the most complex in terms of both song structure and the various tracks and recordings that we had to do in order to put it together. So just to get it in your ears, if you're not familiar with the song, let me get this playing and we'll see what we think.
Force of nature raging to be free. The bloody sky above an angry sea. Surface mass, the peril down below. An innocent ensnared in the undertow. A victim of the current's alibi.
All right, so we get a sense of the track there. At least that's part of the song. If you know the song at all, then you know that it's even more, much more to come and go, etc. Lots of things, lots of different scenes. And I think one thing to think about in terms of the instrumentation and then the mix that relates to that is that the song is conceived of as sort of snapshot scenes, basically. So if one verse is one type of picture, another verse is a different picture. There's what I refer to as a bridge, though there's no chorus to the song. It is, I think folks would probably call this a prog song or a prog-inspired song, just in terms of its complexity of form. It doesn't have any crazy virtuosic playing on it, but it is, perhaps not your typical pop song structure. So as a result of that, I ended up creating a bunch of different ways of approaching the instrumentation and then ways of approaching the mixed treatments of those sounds. I think the first thing that maybe we would notice, and by the way, I'm going to just take a look at the screen here of all the tracks. I'll start by just saying we're here, and if we scroll through, at some point in this song, we will have gone through 150 something sets of channels. So it's quite complicated and way too many signals to sort of dive into at any one given time. But let me see what I can do for maybe focusing on a few aspects of it. As we just heard, I'm going to focus for a little bit on the drums. So the entire first verse has no drums at all. And then once the drums do come in, they're treated differently depending on where we are in the song. So let me solo up the drums that we're hearing now, or maybe just a little before that, but basically, here's the drums. So you can hear that it's, Ben Whitman again is performing, it's actually sort of a kind of a drum and bass approach to it, lots of faster playing between the snare drum and the kick drum. This is just one take, one performance spread out in stereo. There's a little bit of reverberation applied to the snare, not unlike a lot of other things that we're doing. So that's the drum kit for this particular snapshot, which is verse 2. But if we go to another section of the song, you'll note that my drum kit tracks, which are right here in front of us, start very late after the beginning, plays through this whole section, and then stops. Never to return again. Why is that? Is there no drums in the rest of the song? No. There's drums all over the song. But what happens is after this section of the music, there's a little vocal and sort of guitar moment. Then there's a re-entry. But in this re-entry, you'll see this re-entry here, we not only have one drum kit performance, we actually have two simultaneous drum kit performances. So let's cue to this section. And then let me look at what's going on here. So we have drums doubled, right here. Drums and then a double drum left and right channel. Oh my goodness. So here we go. Wow. So two things about that. One is that it's pretty astounding to think of Ben playing this entire performance as one performance and then going for another take of it as a separate performance. And then having me after the fact decide, well, why don't we hear two performances simultaneously? And it's astounding to me how locked it is. It's incredibly precise. If you're not paying any attention, it doesn't sound like two drummers drumming at all. If you're paying attention, the giveaway tends to be in the variations you hear between what he does with the snare drum. Most of the time, what he's doing is exactly the same. So you're hearing two snare hits simultaneously, and they appear in your psycho mind as center channeled. But then there'll be little moments where he does little quick fills, and you hear them as in one channel or the other. We just heard a passage that I think really emphasizes that. So let me roll back just a little bit and listen for that same phenomenon. Listening to the snare just to really hear that. It's also really fun to hear somebody do a tom roll and a snare roll at the same time. So there are lots of giveaways that it's not a single performance. Now one would ask, why maybe do that? Part of that is building in sort of an ever-escalating sense of dynamic. So there's no drums for an entire first verse, which is almost a minute of the song. Then when the drums come in, they make a big entrance, and we're really interested in the drums because we haven't heard them for a while. Then some other things happen. Then this section comes back in, and to amplify that even further, now there are two drum kits playing. I think part of it is that type of drum kit style, the drum and bass thing, kicks and snares very fast. It doesn't quite have as many of the big drum tom fills that you might hear in a rock song. So to generate a little more energy, I thought I could hear just multiple drum kits. I'm not the first person to do that. It happens a lot in other places. Ringo does it several times on Beatles tracks, usually not doubling exactly what he's playing, but often creating a multi-kitted drum performance. Nonetheless, that's what's happening here. By the way, Ben was not playing to himself, he just played, and I decided to do this after the fact. Okay, what that requires, however, is that I create back here, I decided that in order to treat everything, not just to pan a performance to one section or the other, but to also recreate any kind of EQs, any kind of reverberations, that if it's primarily in a left channel, then the reverberations might primarily be in the left channel. So there's still some distinctiveness to the drum kits. That meant chopping them up and flying around and basically creating mirror image. So this set, if I think of it from, say, here, up through here. That's one performance. And then below that, starting here, is the second drum performance. So there's a lot to see there. And you can see I did a little bit of editing, but not a much. This is just basically a couple of takes have been thrown on top of one another. And the editing that I did was simply to set up the transitions for scenes rather than to sort of corrective anything. So that's an interesting doubling. The other thing that then happens with the drums is that we come to the end of this section. And again, a big gap in drumming. Well, this is because stylistically we arrive at the bridge. Let me take everything out of solo mode and let's just hear what's happening at the so-called bridge section for me.
Peaceful calm, no one beside.
You can hear that it's musically very different from the energy that we just had preceding with all that drum and bass double-tracked drum kit. Now, what's about to happen is let's call it a fourth drum scene. So in other words, I've taken Ben's drum performances, spread them out, assigned them to different faders because I'm treating them differently, in part because of how they function. At this moment in the song, the drum kit is back to a single performance in stereo, but also not the drum and bass energy, but a more traditional sort of rock ballad playing. And that required a slightly different treatment in terms of reverberation on the toms, in terms of timbre on the snare drum. So here is what I refer to down here. And believe me, keeping track of all these channels is a nightmare in the mix situation. What I believe I've got somewhere in here is noted as bridge drums, indeed. Here. So now we'll hear that. Here they come. Now, what you're hearing there is but basically a dry drum kit. It's going to get bigger, but at that moment, I think that I am probably applying more of the effect at the drums themselves. Most likely here, maybe a bit of something on the snare. Ah, yes, snare and capital chamber. Okay, so let's go back and open up some of that reverberation that is otherwise missing. And you see, my goodness, there's just a lot of this. So rolling back just a bit to hear the drum entrance with the reverberation applied. And somebody else is being fed. Finally got rid of those guitars, sorry. So there's the drum kit in its rock ballad glory, but then of course there's that little metric modulation, as it were, that shifts us from the slower boom, 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 ba to the boom, boom, ba, boom, boom, ba kind of a rhythm. There is a lot of stuff going on here. The snare drum in particular is tuned to a lower frequency. Ben himself did that at the recording stage. So even when he sent me the tracks to work with, he recognized that that bridge section needed a different sonic treatment. I think he even changed snares. So it's a different snare drum that he's hitting, a deeper, rounder tone. And then I apply a different amount of processing to that as well. You can see here my standard muting of drums by going in and basically getting rid of anything that isn't a tom on each track, so you only hear the toms open up when he plays them, and otherwise I cut everything out. We've talked about that in earlier deep dives, how to clean up drum track the sound of other parts of the drum kit in these channels that maybe you've over accentuated certain frequencies in, for example. That's what my rationale for that is. At any rate, there's this drum kit. Now there is one weirdity as it is. So here we are in the slow section. That's fine. You can hear Ben playing the ride cymbal. Ding, ding, ding. Now, when he changes his groove, I felt like there was something a little bit missing. So I added a ride sample. Well, it's a ride cymbal, kind of. What I really wanted was the bell. I didn't have that in my little cheap setup here. What I had here was a late 1980s synthesizer that had some really bad 8-bit samples of drums in them. And I just sat there and played dang, 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 dang. It's not particularly well in time. It's pretty embarrassing if we solo it up. I'm not gonna. And you know, in some ways, it's a bit of it's disrespectful to Ben's playing to have this thrown on top of what he's doing. I did go to the trouble of not playing when he would have played a tom fill. So the idea is to disguise this, is to make you think he's playing that. Maybe it's not necessary, but when I add all the parts in, when I add all the guitars in, and I'm thinking I wanted to, for this section, when we get to the guitars, I'll show you this, to sort of have this overlay of different metrical parts. Once this part came in, I thought like the ding, 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 ding was getting lost. So I added it. Sorry, Ben. I kind of regret doing it as a musician, but as a producer, it seemed to serve the mix. So I did. That's what that is. We get to the end of this section so that it finishes. And in a small amount of time, we end up resetting for our double drum set yet again. And so let me go back and open up, solo up the double drums again. Okay, there's that. Drums come back in. Those of you watching this might note that this channel here, the kick double, has the two kick drums being processed with a different type of compression. And you can see in the meters, the left and rights, the different kick hits that he's doing. Many times it's exactly the same, although maybe not at the same amount of energy. But even in terms of timings, there is a phenomenon in mixing drums wherein lower frequencies, mixing anything really, lower frequencies tend to not be, in our perception, isolated in specific points. The higher the frequencies, it's easier for us to pinpoint a placement in space. The low frequencies just seem to come at us. And so therefore, it's generally practiced that a kick drum will be sent equally to both channels in stereo. But in this case, one kick drum is all the way to one side, one kick drum is all the way to the other side. That has the effect of keeping the kick with its respective drum kit performance, but it has the negative quality of seeming to make the kick drum less robust in the low end, because it's no longer getting fed from both speakers. And so that's why this kick drum channel is being give an even more low-end boost, a little more mid-cut, to try to help compensate for what's happening in its broad stereo panning. So I'm overdoing the low end on this section of the kick drum. All right, it's fun to listen to Ben. We could do that all day. But let's move on to a different part of the song to sort of think a little bit about how all that double drumming is working. And part of that, I'm going to roll back to the beginning of the song and let you think about how this one guitar part, which takes a while to happen, becomes as many guitars as we end up with. So the first guitar stuff we end up with, I don't even know where it is at this point. It's got to show up here somewhere. Maybe there it is. And that's vocal. There's guitar. Okay. Soloing this up. So what you're hearing is basically me playing electric guitar with my fingers direct into the recording apparatus, not going through an amplifier. And you're hearing 2 tracks of me. In an earlier deep dive, I talked about doubling electric guitars. That's exactly what's happened here. It's pretty much as close as I can get to playing exactly the same thing twice, one appearing in one channel, one appearing in the other. So again, not paying attention from a distance, it's just one set of information, but under headphones or really listening in speakers, you will get a sense of the differential between those two, and it will give you a broader, I think, more immersive sense of the guitar part. And interestingly, this song really is just my voice and that guitar for a very long stretch of time. This is my voice you're seeing here. We'll get all the way up to its finale of that section coming up here. Okay, now at the conclusion of this section, I needed more things to happen. So rather than treat it as an overdub, although I think in some ways this is just my lazy approach to things, I kept the same 2 channels of the guitar and simply added more processing. So there's an automation point at the end of this last little chord here. You'll hear me switch on a additional chorus and an additional amp simulator, little distortion. Here comes the change. It's actually there. We're just not hearing it being sent. Let me look at where it's coming from. Okay, let's make sure the Roland is being opened up. A lot of things to process here. Ah, it is not. So let's roll back and hear what that means. You can imagine, having to do this all the time in the mixing stage. Ay, ay, ay. All right, so unprocessed becomes processed. That's it. So I've changed the color of the guitars without really adding more guitars. Nonetheless, that sound's going to go through for the rest of the song on this type of performance. And that covers a lot of ground for a long time. Then it's when we get to that bridge thing that I alluded to. That's where we add up more guitars. And this is where the beginning of all that guitarness comes from the acoustic guitars. Acoustic guitars make their entrance at the bridge, as it were. Now, the acoustic guitars are doing the same thing. Yes, it's two performances. As you might be able to tell from here, it's a microphone and a direct injection, in other words, taking from the bridge pickup on the guitar. So two signals for each guitar, two guitars, panned left and right. And in addition to that, they are going through another sort of flange software processing so that it's taking the mid and upper frequencies of the track and modulating them, shifting them in time and in amplitude so that we hear kind of an audible on top of the guitar notes. Rolling back to hear that. If you all know the album Pink Floyd's The Wall, you might know the track Hey You, which has exactly that. Doubled acoustic guitars treated with flanging, so an homage. So that's one set of guitar stuff that's going on. We stopped at a moment where there's even more guitar about to happen. And in this case, it's arpeggiated guitar. And like the acoustics, multiple sound sources doubled. You'll hear them coming in just a second. You can see them coming in on your screen. And here they come. So musically, you've got my acoustic guitar going ba da 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 ba da 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 da, and you've got the electrics going don 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 don, which is a 6 and a 3, and then they line up on top of each other, two little acoustic guitar notes per one electric guitar note. Okay, we are getting into prog world here, right? That's all well and good. It sort of has that flow, but then we change the underpinning that the drums do and add more guitars to create a different set of rhythmic ideas going on. Can't really hear them as much, the new guitars that I've brought in, the strum and the groove guitar. On the other hand, if I keep these guitars soloed but go back and add our bridge drums in, you'll hear that shift. Remembering that this is the section of the bridge drums where they have the big rock ballad moment and then turn from a slow 6 to more of a 12. 6, 12s, 3s, 2s, 4s, right? But hear the drums and the guitars together. I think it'll all make sense. If I mute those arpeggiation guitars, which are more prominent in the mix, you'll hear the interplay of these newer guitars with the drum kit even better. Fun. And of course, the arpeggiation guitars never stop either. All right, so there's that. That bridge section has its own set of identities, perhaps even more than one over time. When the section completes, then we go back to the musical phrase we've heard before. And And once we return to that, I bring back the double kick, two different drum kits approach. And that's how we go through to the end of the song. So it is kind of a bit of a recapitulation just in terms of mixed snapshots. But relatively sparse. I mean, it's thick. There are several guitars. There's not necessarily a bunch of different information happening in them. And we haven't done much in terms of keys, etc. There is a bass, Greg Porter playing bass. I haven't heard that other than when I open up the whole mix, but it's all there in one big picture. Now, other complications in this. Well, there are lots of treatments happening in my voice. So if we roll back to the very beginning and look at this, we see, my scratch vocal, which I will not be unmuting, but we do see the lead vocal, my standard parallel compression to help bring out the clarity in the voice. But then this reversed reverb thing, which is exactly what you think it is. So let's solo these things up, shall we?
History retreats like a dying word, indistinct and gasping to be heard. Long for.
And what is that? Well, so it's me taking my vocal performance and recording it with a whole lot of reverberation. And then in the computer, taking that reverberation recording and running it backwards. So you hear me anticipate the word that so history in the first verse is what's, you're hearing reverberating in this.
History retreats like a dying word, indistinct.
Indistinct in reverse with reverb in front of the word indistinct. And this goes through the entire first verse in terms of processing. It's something that I had to create in the computer and do all sorts of things. Back in the analog days, we could do these sorts of tricks much more easily, and that's where they come from. So using tape, flipping the tape upside down makes it backwards. So you could flip it, record reverberation, and then flip the tape back, and now your reverberation is recorded in reverse. Standard, easily done trick. Took a lot more work to do it on the computer than it would have in the analog days. But I'm an analog raised consciousness guy, so I still think about those types of things as options. Okay, so that's one set of things that happens. As we move through the track, though, I decide to treat the vocal a little differently. Each verse has a different sonic signature. So if we get to this stuff, I do want to look at where I'm treating what's going on with it, because I'm not sure these things always get opened up. You see, my goodness, the man has a lot of things in line, ready to go. Yes. Let me just make sure that they're opening up so we can hear them. So the next thing will be a little bit of distortion, I think, and some delays that are happening. Now, again, there may be some other instrumentation that's getting fed to these. I have a feeling that at the very least we should be able to hear some reverberations and some delays in the vocal.
A force of nature raging to be free. The bloody sky above an angry sea. The surface masks the peril down below. An innocent ensnared in the undertow.
Okay. And yes. So we're going to keep that for a whole verse. And then we're going to get to another verse. And in that verse, I'm not sure where I am actually. Yeah. So in that verse, I end up processing even further, more effects. These effects include a ring modulator, an amp simulator. We're going to hear the voice processed very differently.
A data stream of endless terabytes. relayed over floating satellites, repeating lies the truth cannot refute.
So the ring modulator is the thing that's really electronic in the voice sound. It's being divided and panned, so it abruptly is shifting from one channel to the other.
The culture of binary absolutes.
In addition to that, I'm panning the lead vocal slightly
Sweat and blood of third
across
world
channels.
factories, converted into foreign currencies.
Now,
Well, love
lug, 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 lug. So what you're hearing is a whole lot of processing on top of a vocal. Is that all necessary? Well, probably not. But for me, I'm creating a particular sonic landscape to match the lyric. So the lyric at this stage is sort of talking about globalization, telecommunications, and economic exploitation. In other words, our current modern day world. And so I wanted the sound of my voice to be processed to sort of emulate, okay, it is being thrown across satellites and bounced around the world. In addition to that, there are other sounds that we'll be hearing in a minute, I'll show you. But it's to sort of dehumanize my voice as much as possible. And that's what this is doing. The first verse has none of that processing, which is meant to humanize, to make the voice much more intimate, much more direct. When I'm talking about empathy and humanity, that's a direct one. The second verse is retelling the story of watching someone drown in the ocean. And for that, I wanted the delays and more reverberation to sort of pull the human voice into a distance, to make the singer an observer rather than someone who's experiencing the drowning. It's someone who's experiencing the observation, the witnessing of the drowning, which is a different experience, obviously. And so there's sonically different treatment for the voice in verse 2 than there is in verse 1. Verse 3, where we are now, is all the globalization stuff, and that's where it's particularly highly processed. The last verse, which is going to be more about the second verse, only this time the narrator is in the water drowning with others. And so it's sort of a summation of all three verses now in the fourth verse, and we hear a different approach to the processing as a result of that. So, you can play with processing and gizmos just because it's fun, just because you have them. But often I think we are prompted to do this in the service of the song, in this case for me, in the service of the lyric narrative, what is being said at any given time, and how can we support that both musically and sonically in the mix. That's my choice. Okay, so there's that kind of vocal processing. There are other sections in the song, I'll get to this, so let's roll back, where it's not necessarily a matter of effects, but rather a matter of having voices add on to create more lush harmony. So I've done this before on lots of songs. In this case, it is a harmonic. I don't think I ended up deleting it, but look at all this. There's a ton of it. Oh my goodness. I'm going to open it all up. I may regret that. In this case, I created a chorale. So in the song Giving You a Warning, I was doing more pop song oriented vocal doubling and creation. But in this case, I wanted something that was a little more larger voiced. So we have lots of different parts. 1, 2, 3, in other words, lower voice. This is all the same pitch, but I gave myself 3 attempts, 3 different performances of the same part to create, what you might have in a bass, baritone, tenor kind of vocal group. So here is this section of the song with all of those vocals.
Peaceful calm. No alarm. This silent world.
Kind of interesting to me to hear somewhere in one of those parts there is a bird that recorded outside the window. Just quickly hear one cheep and then it's gone. So that's my little peaceful chorale. Took a lot of parts to get that done. You see them, not including the bass, we see them here. All of this section is that overdub vocal part, which seems like a lot of work, but in many ways it's just taking a performance, singing it, maybe doing another take, maybe doing a third take, and then taking all three of those takes and saying, fine, that's good, moving on, adding the parts, creating the chorale that way. The way I work with vocals, because I'm the one singing them, I don't necessarily, in fact, I mostly don't write it down as a score, but rather just sort of think, maybe I'll have my guitar with me and go, so it should be like this, and maybe it moves to this. So I create those chorales fairly spontaneously, which sometimes means you end up with harmony vocal 13, delete, I'm not sure, i.e., I'm not sure if this part is correct. It's probably a hybrid of 2 or 3 parts all in one performance where I got a little confused and maybe decided not to use it, or maybe I decided it didn't really matter. It's in a chorale. Okay, this goes away. But the vocals come back. We end up in a different type of chorale situation during that bridge. So I'll play you this first part of the chorale vocal, or a part of it anyway, so you get a sense of what that melody is. And again, you can see it's got the vocal plus my vocal compression. That's a schematic that I'm just using across the song.
Melt and flow, thoughts dissolve, worlds revolve.
Okay, now when the band comes back with this other groove, there's a chorale to sing that same type of same type of verse.
Gentle stream, languid dream, endless sleep, fathoms deep, river wide, ocean tide.
You get the idea. So it's not particularly revolutionary in its harmonic quality, but nonetheless, it's a thick chorus. I should say, let's kill the solo button and hear what's going on with the band during all that chorale stuff. We've heard it before. This is actually the moment where the drums shift from slow 6 to this 12 groove, all these electric guitars, acoustic guitars. This is in some ways the biggest moment in the song in terms of numbers of sounds happening at once. So you might wonder, why go to the trouble to create all of that chorale and then bury it in the soup of all that sound? And the answer is, I don't know. I think often when we're creating the arrangements, or when I'm creating arrangements and mixes, it's more about you've assembled a block of sound, and you're going to treat the block of sound, the chorale, position the chorale within the mix. Can I hear the words? Some would argue maybe you can't. For me, yep, just enough, because I want this big sound to be happening all around. Can you hear each individual part of the chorale? No, I definitely can't, and I sang them. But they're there as one block of sound. Likewise, nobody's singing the viola part, but it's in there as part of that mass of strings. Speaking of, so yes, I often do, as we've seen in some of the other tracks, record an orchestra. And in this case, what did I do? Yeah, it's my usual attempt at 2 layers of performance from several groups of musicians. So I've got 10 string players, 3 violin, 3 viola, 3 violin 1, 3 violin 2, so 6 violin, and then 2 viola, 2 cello. And then we do another recording, and so there's double that. So those same players show up twice at a time. And that gives me 20 string players for the price of 10. And that's basically why I do it that way. I treat them a little differently in the mix in order to kind of create a faux orchestral sound. Let's go and see if we can solo up the strings separate from what we're doing to everything else. Yes. And I may need to look to see about what I find for, well, no. You need the string chamber. Oh, good, it's already soloed. So, listening to the strings, wherever they've disappeared to. They come and they go. They do lots of different things. I think you'll hear them get bigger here. Now, okay, so they're kind of lush, but they also have a little rhythmic propulsion going on with them. Writing for strings is helpful because it tends to happen when most of the other parts have been recorded. And so I can create scores that reference other parts of the album. And so you may have the guitars doing something that I want to either emphasize by doubling up in the strings, or maybe create a counterpoint to, or commentary, maybe a response to the call. Sometimes I can make the strings appear to initiate the call and some other instrument does the response. In this case, you've probably heard, well, I'll just play it again, just a little section of this. There's sort of the dun 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 always happening, and then some upper voices sustaining. But every once in a while, all of the voices play a rhythmic passage. So let's hear one of those. Like that. So why, where? Well, in many cases, the score is in response to the drum fills that Ben was playing. And I think what's most effective for me is if we're listening to this part of the strings, we should also be listening to the drums during this section. And you can hear that really the string orchestration is meant to play off of or play with the drum kit. So you'll hear the change in all of that here. Okay, so arranging for strings in order to fit in with that drum kit and to create some coherence in all this instrumentation. Right, now the other component of this particular recording that does happen at various other stages on the album is the incorporation of sound effects. But in this case, the sound effects are much more numerous than in some of the other tracks on the album. And like the rest of the mixing and arranging decisions, they're meant to evoke and create different landscapes, different sonic soundscapes, as it were. Let me kill the solo. Let's look at all of that noise stuff. What are all these sound effects about? And where do they happen? Why do they happen? The first set that we hear, you'll note here, are labeled big waves 1 and 2. And they sound a little something like this. Now you can see, perhaps, these are labeled waves, Allen phone and waves, Dar phone. So these were recordings that we made when we were in Hawaii, when the big typhoon was blowing around, and just took our phones, walked down to the shore, and tried to make sure we didn't get washed away. But basically, you're hearing two stereo recordings of the same event. The phones were positioned, 10, 20 feet apart, so you get a larger sense of that stereophonic sound wave. But this is a sound effect that's created by us. It happens to be created within eye distance of where the drowning that happened in real life took place. So there's this is happening underneath the second verse. So when you're hearing me sing about watching someone drown, you're hearing the sound of waves that would have been very similar to what was happening at that moment in time. So it's a sonic way of evoking that experience for both me as writer, singer, and the person who went through part of that, and then you, the listener, bringing you back into my little memory world. It could be waves from some other part in the world recorded by somebody else, but it happens to be more directly tied. Okay, so there's that, a sound effect. Then later on, we have the waves and then a whole bunch of other sounds that are coming up. Well, this is from verse 3, the verse about the globalization, the economics. And so for this, it's evoking satellites, it's evoking money exchange. So there's actually a bit of the Dutch stock exchange dialogue going on here. Let's hear that soundscape. So that's going on underneath that highly processed vocal that I showed you, where the ring modulator is taking my voice and making it very electronic. That's another soundscape picture that's been drawn. Then we come to the end of that verse. You see the strings ending here. And we move to another sound picture. And this is where I have a set of water sounds, beginning with a small creek, moving into a brook, and then eventually a waterfall. There was, for those of you who know the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, there's a song, Good Morning, Good Morning. And at the end of that, they have a bunch of animal sort of farmyard to jungle soundscapes. And though I don't think this actually holds true, the description was that the idea was that each animal sound that you hear would be capable of eating the prior animal. So from smaller animals to larger ones. In my case, I decided to work smaller bits of water. So you start the creek, becomes the brook, becomes the waterfall, becomes the ocean. That's what we have here going on. So while I'm singing and all those little gentle guitars are playing, and then eventually the drums and orchestra comes in, there's this sound effect of water. And maybe we'll hear the difference when the brook comes in. See if you can feel that additional amount of watery sounds. Mostly hearing rocks, brook, the splashing. Here it comes. And then that becomes taken over by the waterfall sound, which will be a little bit deeper, a little bit more robust. All right. Maybe more broadly robust, maybe not any louder. You can hear it, it's getting louder. So that's the idea. I'm using all these water sounds to get me through that bridge, which evokes a gentle stream, languid dream, river wide, all of these sorts of river metaphors and images drawn in the lyric are then replicated in the soundscape. In other words, I'm being very obvious. I'm hitting the nail perhaps too directly on the head. But it does bring us effectively from that gentle stream into a roaring ocean and windscape. So we have wind, we have water, and the water becomes more audible as we move through towards the end of this section. So basically, I'm using these sound effects as I would as if I were using instruments and thinking about mix. What kind of frequency spectrum do I need? How active should it be? How loud should it be? Does it need to come up? Does it need to come down? Does it need to match something dynamically in the track? So I'm sculpting all of this soundscape in order to reflect, amplify, and support what's happening in the instrumentation and performances. And that's why we end up with 100 plus tracks on this album. So on this song, on this album, it's a lot of small details that then become aggregated into larger chunks. So if I've got 14 tracks of me singing a chorale, well, that becomes the chorale chunk. If I've got 20 string players, that becomes the strings chunk. If I've got all of the sound effects, that might be the verse 3 satellite noise chunk. That might be the wind and ocean. That might be the bridge, small to larger waterfall chunk of sounds. So when I think of it that way, and you'll see that's why these things are sort of set up in the, instead of looking at all these individual tracks in this mixer, oh my Lord, you end up assigning them to groups so that I can say, okay, great. I've got my ocean. All of the ocean sound effects being filtered to one fader that I can control. Drums, all those different drums, although the doubles are treated a little differently. My electric guitars all coming to one. I have to maybe create different levels within that group, but then I can sort of get my head around the mix by putting things in groups that are, maybe I'm thinking about 8 to 10 groups rather than 140 different tracks. That's my solution. It's not my own. I'm clearly not the person that invented the group, but I highly recommend when you get into lots of tracks that you start thinking in terms of groups when mixing. So that's basically all that we need to really focus on this track. But I will play, roll back and play some of these transition points because I think that you can get a sense of how all of these parts come together when you hear all of them come together. Let's listen to what's happening. Let me find that section of the verse with, there's my, yeah, let's go in from this verse. We'll hear a more processed vocal and larger stuff happening in the build of everything that comes in. Double kick drums, double kits, string entrance, and then into the bridge. So enjoy. I'm just going to play a little bit of this and let us think about all the elements we've heard and how they're now coming together.
The absolutes. Sweat and blood of third world factories, converted into foreign currencies. Luxury requires a sacrifice. Profit margins built from the marginalized. Peaceful calm, no one. The silent world is beautiful. Letting go, melt and flow. Thoughts dissolve, worlds revolve. Gentle stream, languid dream, endlessly fathoms deep, river wide, ocean tide, open nights, still alive.
And that's basically all of the elements that put together add up to the song Currents from the album Currents. And that'll conclude this episode of our deep dive. I hope that was interesting to you all. Thanks for tuning in, and check us out next week. We're coming back for another one. But I will see you then, and hope you all have a wonderful week. Take care, everyone.